Washington, D.C., 1972. The sun rose pale over the Potomac, casting long shadows across the marble steps of the Capitol. But inside a secure wing of the Pentagon, tensions spread like wildfire. A high-stakes rescue mission was underway, one that depended entirely on a single Soviet-manufactured helicopter grounded at a forward base in Eastern Europe. No one could explain it. The engine was intact, the systems tested green, yet every time they tried to start it, nothing. Technicians had replaced entire wiring systems, fuel injectors, even control boards. They double-checked voltages, reloaded diagnostics. Still, silence. The machine just wouldn't respond. With the press growing restless and international scrutiny looming, General William "Will" Kamen stood under the fluorescent lights of the operations center, staring down at maps and schematics. For decades, he had led from the front, from Korea to intelligence briefings in Berlin, but now he faced a technical dead end, and so he did something no one expected. Something some considered desperate. He called for Robert Orchard. Once a top-tier flight engineer during World War II, Orchard had served with distinction across airfields in North Africa and Italy. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a man who could coax engines back to life with just his ears and his fingertips. But after the war, politics swallowed him. His loyalty to a foreign-aligned unit made him a liability in Cold War eyes. His name quietly faded from the records. He disappeared. Now, Orchard lived alone in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, fixing antique radios in a barn lit by a single hanging bulb. The local kids called him the Wire Man. Few knew his past, and he never offered it. That morning, when two military officers knocked on his door, he stood silent for a long moment. The younger of the two held out an envelope with the Pentagon's seal. Orchard opened it without ceremony, read it once, and nodded. He went back inside. A minute later, he emerged carrying a rusted toolbox, a rolled-up photo, and a small folded letter. His jacket was too thin for the season, his boots worn at the soles, but his hands, those scarred, steady hands, still remembered. They flew him out before noon. As the plane cut through the clouds toward the base, no one spoke. Orchard sat by the window, eyes on the horizon. His world, once roaring with engines and shrapnel, had been quiet for decades. But now, something was stirring. Not in the helicopter, in him. If this story resonates with you, tap like and subscribe. True stories like this one deserve to be heard. And what happens next will stay with you long after the final word. Deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, where fog drifts through pine trees like ghosts from another time, stood a weathered barn with no sign on the door. Inside, Robert Orchard sat hunched over a radio the size of a suitcase, wires spilling out like veins. Dust coated every surface. Jazz played softly in the background from another unit, one he'd rebuilt from scratch. For most folks in the nearby town, Orchard was a curiosity, the quiet old man who could fix anything that crackled or buzzed. Kids whispered stories about how he once made a shortwave signal bounce off the moon. He never corrected them. He never said much at all. His past didn't hang on his walls. No medals, no pictures of squadrons or planes, just shelves of resistors, soldering irons, spare tubes, and the steady hum of electricity. At exactly 6:42 a.m., the sound of tires crunching gravel shattered the quiet. A government vehicle rolled to a stop outside. Orchard didn't flinch. He set down his pliers, stood slowly, and walked toward the door, his back still straight, his limp barely noticeable. Two men in uniform stepped out, one older, one fresh-faced. The older one offered a firm nod. The younger held a sealed envelope. "Mr. Orchard?" "That's right. You've been requested by General William Kamen. Immediate transport, classified mission." Orchard took the envelope, opened it, read it once, then looked up with the kind of stare that made the younger officer shift uncomfortably. He must be real desperate. He didn't ask questions. He turned, walked back inside. After a few minutes, he emerged with a battered metal toolbox, an old military jacket, and a tube containing a single photograph. The officers glanced at each other. One started to ask something, but the older one shook his head. Let the man be. As they drove down the winding road toward the military airfield, Orchard didn't speak. His gaze rested on the hills rolling by, on the trees just starting to turn gold. The base was a hive of activity. Helicopters lined the tarmac, mechanics, pilots, officers, all moving with urgency. But when Orchard stepped out of the jeep, time seemed to slow. The soldiers nearby turned. They saw an old man in a faded jacket and scuffed boots. Whispers rippled. "Who's that? Why's he here?" "Najit. Was he even in our system?" Orchard ignored it all. He spotted the hangar, walked straight toward it. Inside stood the machine, the Soviet chopper that had refused to respond. It loomed like a sleeping beast, wires exposed, panels open. A young technician approached him, nervous, clipboard in hand. "Sir, we've already tried." "I don't care what you tried." Orchard's voice was quiet but final. "I want to see her alone." They hesitated, then, with a glance at the officer in charge, stepped back. The hangar cleared. Orchard dropped his toolbox beside the helicopter. He reached out, touched the frame, fingers trailing across the rivets like reading Braille. He closed his eyes for a moment. The silence returned. The only sound was his breath, slow, measured, and then, without a word, he went to work. Inside the cockpit, he traced every cable, felt for inconsistencies, found a critical grounding wire out of place, tiny, barely noticeable. Then another. A pressure seal deteriorated with time, not visible on scans. The kinds of problems no computer could find, but a human who'd once crawled through wreckage could feel in his bones. Outside, soldiers waited. The young technician said, almost to himself, "No way he'll fix it. That thing's dead." But in the hangar, Orchard moved with the rhythm of memory, each motion precise, each sound familiar. He worked not like someone solving a puzzle, but like someone speaking a language no one else remembered. When he finally reconnected the main power relay, he paused, wiped his hands. Then, quietly, he pressed the ignition. A low hum, a flicker of light on the dash. Then, the engine coughed, once, again, then roared. Outside, silence fell. One by one, heads turned. The rotor blades began to spin, slow and heavy at first, then faster, slicing the air with growing confidence. The doors opened. Orchard stood there, hands blackened, expression unreadable. General Kamen was already there, having watched from a distance. He stepped forward, eyes locked with the man he had once known, and quietly pushed aside. "I knew you'd figure it out." Orchard looked past him, toward the helicopter. She just needed someone to remember how she used to breathe. Once the rotors slowed and the echoes of the engine faded into silence, Robert Orchard found himself alone again. This time, not by command, but by instinct. The hangar had emptied out, and while voices still murmured beyond the steel doors, none dared step inside. The air was heavy with dust and the faint scent of oil and burnt metal, but to Orchard, it smelled like something else entirely. Familiarity, the echo of his youth, the breath of machines that once whispered their secrets only to him. He stood before the helicopter for a moment longer, his hand still resting on the frame, fingers pressed against the cold metal as though feeling for a pulse. This wasn't just a mechanical problem solved. It was a memory resurrected, a bridge between decades, and a quiet defiance against time itself. With deliberate movements, he opened the side panel again, not because it was necessary, but because he needed to be sure, needed to feel the systems respond to his hands, like a heartbeat that had returned. The lighting above him flickered, catching the sheen of oil on his tools, and for a moment, Orchard was not an old man in a borrowed hangar, but a war-hardened mechanic in a field tent in Anzio, fixing a fighter's propeller with only minutes to spare before another bombing run. He crouched beside the exposed engine, his knees protesting, but he paid them no mind. His hands moved steadily, tracing wires and connectors with a precision that no modern tablet or diagnostic screen could replicate. He didn't look at monitors or schematics. He listened with his fingers, with his skin, with the part of him that had never really stopped being a mechanic, even when the world no longer asked him to be one. Every click of a socket, every adjustment of a valve, every tightening of a screw was like a verse in a poem only he remembered. He found a loose relay that had shifted subtly from heat and pressure, not enough to trigger a fault in the system, but just enough to break continuity under load. He replaced it with a spare, one he'd carried in his kit since 1953, its label faded, but its function still intact. As he worked, he began to speak, not loudly, not for anyone to hear, but in a low murmur that carried weight only for him. He wasn't talking to the helicopter, he was talking to Janie. Do you remember that Catalina we had to pull apart by lantern light? How we thought we could hear the Pacific in the fuel lines if we just listened long enough. His voice cracked slightly, but his hands never paused. I didn't save her then, but maybe this one I can. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. The hangar doors creaked. A tech peeked in, saw him still bent over the machine, and silently backed away. They didn't understand what they were watching, but they felt it was something too rare to interrupt. When Orchard finally stood, his back stiff and sore, the engine was humming again, not fully engaged but warm, breathing like a dog roused from sleep that recognized its master's scent. He wiped his hands, took a slow breath, and stepped into the cockpit. The interior was utilitarian and unfamiliar in some ways, Soviet design, harsh angles, sharp corners, but the bones were the same as every aircraft he had ever known. He adjusted the seat, flicked 3 switches, and paused. His fingers hovered over the ignition. For a moment his hand trembled. His hand. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the letter creased and oil-stained, that he had carried for nearly 30 years. It wasn't long, just a few lines, written after Janie's crash, after the engine failed, after Orchard had checked and rechecked and still come up empty. I know I checked everything, I swear I did, but something went wrong, and now you're gone. If I ever fix another engine, it won't be for duty. It'll be for you. He didn't read it again. He just held it there between the throttle and the glass, and then gently placed it beneath the edge of the dashboard, as if the helicopter too should know who this work was for. Then he turned the key. This time the startup was smooth, not loud, not dramatic, just certain. The turbine whined to life, the instrument lights blinked green in unison, and the cabin thrummed with a steady, confident pulse. From outside, a few heads turned. The young technician who had doubted him whispered, "He did it again." Inside, Orchard closed his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just sat there, one hand resting on the control stick, the other on his lap, and listened. Not to the machine, but to the silence inside him that had, for the first time in years, gone still. After the startup test was complete and the hangar slowly returned to its usual rhythm of radio chatter, footfalls and engine torque, Robert Orchard remained behind, seated not in the cockpit, but on a metal bench just outside the bay doors, half in shadow, half in late afternoon sun. His hands, still bearing the grime of the repair, rested palms up on his knees. His eyes were fixed on a point far beyond the horizon, as if watching something that no longer existed. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the small folded letter, the same one he had carried in his pocket for nearly 30 years. The paper was soft from age, the corners curled, and a few faint stains, perhaps oil, perhaps something else, dotted its surface like old fingerprints. He didn't need to open it to remember what it said. Every word was etched into him like a scar that never quite healed. But this time, he did open it. The creases crackled softly. The ink, faded but still legible, had bled in a few places. Yet the meaning remained untouched, raw, honest, unfinished. "Janie, I checked it. I checked it 3 times. I ran the fuel lines. I listened to the engine run cold. I did everything I was trained to do, but I missed something, and now you're gone. They said it wasn't my fault, but I was the last one to touch the plane. I was the last one who could have stopped it. You said, Don't worry, Rob, she'll fly, she always does. And I nodded like I believed it. If I ever fix another engine, it won't be for a mission. It'll be for you, because you were the only one who trusted me when no one else did. Orchard stared at the words for a long moment. He didn't cry. Not now. He had done enough of that when the telegram arrived, when the coffin was sealed, when the uniform came home with no boots inside. But here now, sitting in front of a helicopter that had roared to life under his hands, something in him shifted. It wasn't relief, and it wasn't pride. It was a kind of silence, not emptiness, but completion. Behind him, the steel doors of the hangar opened with a creak. General Kamen stepped out, holding a clipboard in one hand, but clearly not here for paperwork. He stopped a few paces away, noticing the letter in Orchard's hands. That his? Orchard nodded. Wrote it the week after his crash. Never sent it. Didn't think it would matter anymore. The general hesitated, then sat down beside him on the bench, keeping a respectful distance. You never told anyone about it? Wasn't the kind of story people wanted to hear. It matters now. Orchard handed him the letter. Kamen read it slowly. When he was done, he folded it back carefully as if it might fall apart if he moved too fast. He died on my watch too, you know. You weren't the only one who blamed himself. They sat there, two old men who had once worn uniforms that now hung in closets, sharing a silence that needed no explanation. After a moment, Orchard took back the letter. He stood, walked toward the helicopter, and stepped up onto the skid. He reached into the cockpit, found a small crevice near the instrument panel, and slid the folded paper behind it, not hidden, but placed. A marker, a memory. If she flies again, he said, not turning around, she flies with him. Later that evening, as the crew prepared for final deployment and mission approval, someone noticed a small item had been added to the interior of the helicopter. Hanging from a bolt near the co-pilot's seat was a dog tag, not registered to any current pilot. The name etched on it was Janet Orchard. The tag hadn't been there earlier. No one had seen Orchard place it, but no one asked either. They simply let it be, because some things don't require explanation. A young pilot, Lieutenant James Callahan, fresh out of school, approached Orchard just before sunset. "Was that your sister's tag?" Orchard smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd offered all day. "She was my kid's sister, stubborn, smarter than me, flew better too. She was a pilot, one of the first. Back when they told her she'd never see the cockpit, but she did, until she didn't." Callahan stood quietly, then he reached into his own collar, pulled out his tags, and slipped one off the chain. "You mind if I keep hers with mine on this mission?" Orchard looked him in the eye, saw the sincerity, and nodded once. "Just remember who you're flying with." The morning of the mission broke with a pale sky and a stillness that seemed to settle over the airfield like a held breath. The mountains where the rescue would take place remained shrouded in fog, and winds were expected to shift mid-morning, threatening any chance of a clean descent. But the plan held. The rotorcraft was ready. The crew had been briefed, and Lieutenant Callahan now carried not only his own orders, but something far heavier, a dog tag with a name no one on the manifest recognized, but which meant everything to the man who had made the machine fly. Robert Orchard was already at the hangar when the team arrived. He didn't speak much, hadn't since the night before, but his presence alone was grounding. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, his weathered face turned toward the aircraft, as if watching a friend prepare for a long journey. As the crew did their final checks, Orchard stepped forward. He didn't ask. He just moved slowly toward Callahan, who noticed and paused. From his pocket, Orchard pulled a small object wrapped in cloth. It was a metal switch cap, worn and bent slightly at the edges. He placed it in Callahan's hand without explanation, only saying, "This came off a B-25 in 44, pulled it out of a crash site. Thought I'd keep it until I found someone who'd understand why it matters." Callahan turned it over in his palm. It was nothing spectacular, a piece of machinery most would have thrown out. But he understood. It was history, loss, survival, memory in metal. "I'll keep it safe," he said, voice low. "No," Orchard replied, looking him dead in the eye. "You'll use it. She flies because you respect her. Don't ever forget what she cost." Minutes later, the rotor blades spun to life, slicing the morning air with a rhythm that felt less like mechanical motion and more like a heartbeat resuming after years of silence. The helicopter lifted from the tarmac, steadied itself, and moved toward the mountains, its shadow shrinking into the distance. Orchard didn't watch the whole ascent. He turned away just as the aircraft disappeared behind a rise, knowing full well that watching wouldn't change the outcome. He walked back into the hangar, sat at the edge of a crate, and folded his hands. The silence returned. Hours passed. No one disturbed him. Then, the first radio call crackled through. "Target location reached. Visibility low but stable. Landing in progress." A pause. Then, "Families located, no casualties, preparing for extraction." Orchard didn't move. Later, returning to base, ETA 40 minutes, mission success. When the helicopter finally returned, its landing was smooth, purposeful, a machine that knew its role and fulfilled it. As the crew stepped out, their uniforms streaked with sweat and dirt, Callahan carried something extra in his hand, the switch cap, now smudged with oil and fingerprints. He walked straight toward Orchard and offered it back. "You were right. She flew." Orchard nodded but didn't take the piece back. "No, she flew for you now. I was just the reminder." That evening, a small ceremony was held. Informal, no press, no medals, just people who knew what had happened and wanted it remembered. General Kamen stood before the gathered crew and base staff and cleared his throat. "There are missions we complete because we're trained to, and there are missions we survive because someone else carried the weight before we arrived. Today was the second kind." He turned to Orchard, who stood quietly at the back. Robert Orchard didn't just repair a machine, he repaired a moment in history that most of us forgot. A promise between family, service, and sacrifice. And he reminded us that no amount of new technology replaces the heart behind the work. He held out a small black box. Inside was a medal for civilian contribution in military operations, not common, not flashy, but deeply meaningful. Orchard didn't step forward to receive it. Instead, Callahan did, at the general's nod, and placed the medal into Orchard's hand without fanfare. After the ceremony, most people returned to their duties. But the younger techs lingered near Orchard, unsure what to say, but certain they wanted to say something. One finally spoke. "You think machines have memories?" Orchard looked up, his voice soft but clear. "No, but the people who build them do. And if you listen closely, sometimes you'll hear them speak." That night, Orchard returned to his quarters on base. He didn't head back to the mountains just yet. He stayed long enough to clean the tool set he'd used, wrap it in canvas, and place it in a steel locker marked only with the number 6117, the tail number of the helicopter that flew. 2 weeks after the mission, Robert Orchard returned to his cabin in the Virginia hills. The gravel crunched beneath the weight of the old government vehicle that dropped him off, and as the sound faded behind him, the silence of the woods folded back around his home like an old coat, familiar and worn. The barn was just as he left it, wires hanging, soldering irons still on the bench, radios mid-repair, dust collecting in corners untouched by urgency. He didn't touch anything right away. Instead, he walked to the small table near the window, opened a drawer, and took out a wooden frame. Inside it, he placed 2 things. The faded photograph of him and Janie standing in front of a broken fuselage with grins bigger than their uniforms, and a copy of the letter he'd never sent, now unfolded, pressed flat behind the glass. He set it on the wall, not high, not low, just eye level, as if it had always belonged there. Then he sat, not to work, just to listen. Outside, the breeze moved through the trees like static on a clear channel. In the distance, a hawk circled. His tools remained untouched, but the quiet was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. The next day, 2 neighborhood boys brought in an old radio that didn't work. One of them had written, "Fix me," in pencil across the back panel. Orchard smiled. "That's the idea," he said. "Always is." He took the radio, placed it on the workbench and began to open it up, but before he did, he paused. His hand hovered over the power cord, and then he said, not to the boys, but maybe to the past, sometimes you don't fix a thing to make it work. You fix it because something in you needs to remember how. And maybe that's what it had always been about. Not duty, not medals, not orders, but memory. Because there are some engines that won't turn over no matter how many wires you test or plugs you change, and then suddenly they do, because someone who remembers what they used to sound like finally comes back and listens. If this story spoke to you, leave a like and subscribe. We share true stories like this every day, about service, family, and the quiet kind of courage that lives in forgotten places.